And now I have the pleasure of introducing our panel. Rachel Simnett is a senior research consultant and an expert in finding out what people want from digital products. She's got over 15 years experience in user research and testing. Starting off at the BBC, Rachel has worked on learning projects with organisations big and small, including BP, Land Rover and the military police. Welcome, Rachel.
Hi, Sarah. It's great to be here.
Thank you. John Casey has been battling in the education and technology trenches for more than 20 years. Currently working at City College Glasgow as a senior learning technologist, John is in charge of projects to implement e-assessment and also runs a UFI project on citizen literacy. There's not much John doesn't know about how to combine the technical, education and human elements of an EdTech project. Welcome, John.
Hi, thanks.
And finally, Dan. Dan Whiston is an independent learning designer with more than 20 years experience creating online modules, courses, degrees, learning apps and more for clients across the public and private sectors. Dan also manages projects for UFI, where he has helped some of our most interesting and most challenging projects. Good to have you with us, Dan.
Good to be here, Sarah. Thank you very much. Looking forward to a good discussion.
Okay, right, let's kick off. Our first question is to all of you. This challenge is a tricky one, focusing as it does on groups who are least likely to engage with learning. Tell us about a time when you've had a real challenge to reach a group of learners. What did you do? And Dan, could you start us off?
Of course. So I was thinking about this, and the project that came to mind for me is the FA, the Football Association. Now, I'm not the biggest football fan in the world, so in that sense, I was quite a good proxy user because I needed to start at the beginning. But the learner group was basically, to speak bluntly, rowdy parents who would often shout abuse at referees and perhaps be disruptive during football games. It was part of the FA's wider respect. I'm also trying to counter racism and other forms of unpleasant behaviour. So the kind of change in behaviour that the learning programme wanted to create was that parents would be quieter and they wouldn't disrupt football matches. So the challenge here was that the very people that the FA wanted to reach the most were those least likely to engage with the training programme. Perhaps angry or loud and could be, what's the word? Not play by the social rules. And would perhaps they'd found react rather negatively to being or educated in previous programs they'd had, especially if their existing motivation above and beyond being disruptive was actually in the directly opposite direction, e.g. behaving in a way that they passionately believed in to get their kids to win and succeed. So there was lots of emotional resistance to the training program. And I worked with a very interesting guy, an academic, sports academic. And essentially he...
Dan, sorry, could I just interrupt you? Could you just either speak a bit louder or move your mic up a bit?
Sorry, yes. And basically, is that any better, Sarah? Fantastic.
That's much better, thank you.
So just to really recap what I was saying quickly, the people were particularly resistant to being trained because their kind of emotional position was in opposition to what the trainers wanted to do. They were kind of disruptive and very kind of uber competitive and not helping everyone. So essentially, the academic I partnered up with from Gloucester University used reverse psychology. And the specific way that he did that was firstly to get so-called hard nut players, people in Stuart Pearce and Vinnie Jones. I mean, those are names I don't know particularly well myself, but had a reputation for being very tough. And they got those people to do the videos in the training course. So firstly, that they'd have these role models who would be appealing to the people who weren't wanting to engage, A, and then B, what they literally got them to say was quite clever. It was saying, in my experience as a player, if you want your kid to win and to be a successful professional, you need to shut up, mum and dad, probably dad, being stereotypical. You're holding them back because if you want them to develop the skills they need to do it slowly in a non-pressured environment without some parent, score, score, score. They need to take it slow, do the basics, learn to walk before they could run. And when the content was presented in that way by those advocates, it cut through. And I think the wider point there is to use a trick or an approach I've got from screenwriting for genre fiction. Some people don't like horror stories or thrillers or soap operas or romance, and they come to a piece of writing thinking, I'm going to hate this. they're not motivated to read it or watch it. And what you do, you use the weight of negative expectation from the audience, in this case learners, in a form of learning design Tai Chi to flip around that negative expectation and use it, surprise, to generate buy-in and engagement. So if people are hostile to learning, be very specific about working out why, figure out what they are motivated by, and then appeal directly to their interests as they see them directly, with a bit of guile. Draw them in, show them it's useful, surprise them that it's useful. They'll hope.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Dan. Rachel, do you want to come in and tell us about when you've had to reach a really challenging group of learners?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. My example has got quite a lot of similarities actually to Dan's, but it's in a very different area. So I was working a few years ago for the BBC, and we needed to introduce some compliance training around editorial policy for programme makers. This was extremely challenging because a lot of this audience assumed that they knew everything already. There was nothing that you could teach them. And if they didn't know anything, they would ask a colleague or their editor. They certainly wouldn't listen to any kind of centralised training or learning programme. The problem was things were going wrong, so they didn't know everything. So the other thing that we knew about this group of people was there was a real prevailing culture of rule breaking at any cost in order to win an award. So, you know, if you won a BAFTA, you could basically do anything. And in fact, there's been a fairly recent example, I would say, of that, yeah, which you might remember, Martin Bashir. So anyway, we took all these insights, and what we did was similar to Dan's example. We got hold of some award-winning, well-behaved senior programme makers who had the respect of teams, who had the respect of particularly of journalists, and we asked them to effectively deliver the learning points in our learning. Quite a lot of it through video, and then through them talking about how they tackled a particularly challenging editorial problem, and how the solution had then led to a very successful and ethical program. So we use these videos almost like kind of DVD extras. And I think, just like Dan's example, the key is to understanding what motivates those difficult to reach people. How are you going to appeal to them and get them to engage, but in a positive way? The Tai Chi, as Dan called it. So that's my example.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, that's a really important point, isn't it? About understanding very basic understanding about what motivates your learners. John, do you want to tell us about a project that you've been involved in?
Yeah.
Where you've had to reach some challenging learners?
Yeah, most recently, the most relevant one is the adult literacy project. So there's a literacy that I've been involved in. And really, I suppose my main message is the value of using intermediaries between you and your learners. Sometimes it's very difficult to reach your learners, and there's people between you and your learners that actually can facilitate a lot of the work. So for us, last year, we were developing a smartphone app in the middle of the pandemic. And we were going to have face-to-face testing sessions, workshops and things like that. So we very quickly realized we had to work through intermediaries. And fortunately, in our project, we had very good community links with the organizations that are involved in adult literacy. People, tutors working in councils, people working in charities, and so on, and very good professional networks that enabled us to contact people and involve them as intermediaries. So the kind of people that we were involving were community education tutors employed by councils, trade union learning reps, relatives, friends, people like that. And it worked quite well. And we started to use video conferencing with the intermediaries to get feedback from the learners. We actually had some learners involved in video conferencing sessions with our main tutor, which was, if you like, direct access to learners using technology. We found that concepts such as the learner journey and service design were quite useful to us to start getting our head around where that learner might fit into our product, if you like, and how they might get in touch with us. And we realized it's actually going to be through these intermediaries, because our learners can't read and write properly. Ordinary advertising campaigns are not going to work. So the networking effect is something that we learn a lot from our project as a way of getting in touch with learners. And when you do get in touch with them, even through intermediaries, involving them in testing and feedback, which we did, was really, really useful. And it makes them feel involved. Plus, by using intermediaries with this group of learners, for which there's a great stigma around admitting to having low literacy or being not able to read and write, if you're working with people they trust, things are a lot easier. So trust is a very big issue for these kind of learners.
Thanks, that's really, really useful. We've got a question from Sue McMaster. Sue, do you want to join us on stage and put your question to John?
Am I? Oh, hello. Yes, I'm there. Hi. So the learners were learning online, were they? I just wanted to know, did you have to do any work with them beforehand to get them comfortable using technology? And if so, what did that look like? How did you do that?
I can give you one concrete example, and this is the way it works. A learner in Nottingham approached the local library wanting to read books for adults, not kids. The library got in touch with our lead tutor via email, and our lead tutor got back in touch with the learner somehow, and was in telephone conversations with her. The learner's mother was a teacher, so it was an adult learner who couldn't read and write properly. She was already using a smartphone, and a lot of these learners do use smartphones, contrary to what you might expect. The mother lent the learner her laptop, got her onto the app and got her onto Zoom to join the online class, and that's worked really well. And that online class has got several people who are meeting up every week remotely, and it has been done in that ad hoc way through intermediaries.
Yeah, I've done that with some of the people that I work with. We've had a digital Freedom 50 Plus here that's given out some tablets to disadvantaged people over 50, and I've had them in individually to kind of just get them up and running on it. Okay.
The good thing,
I'm going to have to kind of move on from this now, as we've got quite a lot of ground to cover. Thanks very much for your questions, Sue, and joining us. It's been really, really useful. Thanks, John. Because what we've heard about there, a lot is about the value of using intermediaries. What I want to look at now is the sort of techniques we can use to find out more about our learners, such as user profiling and audience segmentation. Tell us about profiling. What is it, and does it work? Rachel, do you want to talk to us about the technique of profiling?
Absolutely, thanks, Sarah. And I'm just going to share my screen with everybody for a second. Let's just check that has worked. Yeah, great. Okay, so learner profiling. I've been involved in many forms of this probably for about the last 20 years now, and of course the amount that you invest and the outputs that you can get of these from this varies hugely. But essentially, of course, you're doing the same thing, which is to find out a bunch of things about your learners so that the learning you design and you deliver meets their needs and, of course, meets the needs of your organisation. So profiles, of course, take many forms, and we'll have a look at a few examples in a minute. Here's a really quick little checklist of what I would typically include in a profile. So, I mean, demographics, for work-based stuff, that's probably role, time in post and experience as much as anything else. Of course, you need to know what it is people need to learn, and there may be existing knowledge and skills that you need to be aware of. You may have a very mixed group that need to think about that. Access and location, really, really important. How are you going to deliver this? On what platform is most suitable? It might be a smartphone, as John was just talking about. How much time have people got? That again, of course, will affect your design. And then there's the whole slightly thorny issue of learning styles, which, as we know, people learn in many different ways, but quite often we can't cater for all of those. So it's about looking for patterns within certain audiences. And then, of course, barriers is quite a key thing to include here, barriers to learning. Motivation, which we've already heard about, I think absolutely crucial. How are you going to engage people? How are you going to hook them? And how are you going to ensure that the learning really lands with people and is effective? And then there's also, if you're looking at behavioural change, you may want to consider some kind of attitudinal profiling. So it's just a couple of examples really, just to get you thinking. So this is an example of something which is a little old now and probably not done so much. It's effectively like a persona, very visual, quite expensive to produce. This was done for BBC Bite Size, and it's just got a stack of information about these children who are using this product, from attitudinal to education level to what interests them, what motivates them, what their family life is like, whether they've got any pets, and so on. And I think the thing with personas, which is kind of what these are, is that these have pretty much fallen out of fashion now, or out of credibility, to be honest, because they're not actually real people. So we tend to talk more about pen portraits these days. And then I was talking about attitudinal profiling. This is something I've just done very quickly for a local authority on a recent job, where we actually put our audience into one of 4 segments to actually work out if it was training or learning they needed or something else, such as performance management. You can do quite low-tech profiling, of course, just write things down. And one technique that I've borrowed a bit from Agile, I don't know if people are familiar with the idea of user stories, which are all about defining the type of user, their goal, and the reason for that. But you can turn those quite easily into learner stories, as I've done on the right-hand side there. And one thing that I just wanted to mention was just the difference here between needs and wants. So in UX circles these days, and particularly in Agile methodology, it's all about user needs, not about wants or desires. And I think this has sprung out of the desire to avoid what I call the Homer Simpson car example. If anyone remembers, that's when Homer had free rein to design a motor car, and he went around Springfield and asked everybody what their ideal car would be. And of course, the result was a complete mess, because you can't just listen to what audiences say they want. You have to look at what they need. I would argue, though, that as learning designers, we do have to think about wants, because we have to address this question of motivation and engagement. It's not like going on to .gov and getting a new passport, for example, because you can already see the beach in your head with that. So we need to work a bit harder. And then I think finally, the kind of $6 million question around profiling is whether any of it really works or how valuable it is. I mean, there obviously can be pitfalls. You can get very carried away with doing big research projects into your learners, trying to meet everybody's needs and pleasing no one. But I think if you focus in on tangible needs and an understanding of what really motivates people and have that inform your design, I think it's an essential component of knowing your audience. And I will just stop sharing my screen now. So.
Thanks, Rachel. That's absolutely brilliant. Really clear. Dan, John, did you want to come in on any of that?
Sorry. I was just actually contradistinction to Rachel's useful. I don't get shopping. I work for dozens of corporations every year and get a career to design online learning. And usually, writes an email. So, what Rachel was talking about. Oh, I hear you.
I'm sorry, Dan. You're cutting out. I'm going to move away onto John. John, do you have any thoughts on profiling?
No worries. You can just keep your mic a little bit further away from your mouth, Dan. Just a quick tip there. Yeah, user profiling can be really useful, and I think it is worth doing. One of the dangers in any ed tech project is groupthink. You think you've got it sorted and all the rest of it. User profiling can be useful, but the danger is it can lead to like a narrow view of your users, and you get stuck in that view. So, and then paradoxically, if you have gone to the trouble of getting a user profile, make sure you use it. That it's not just a tick box exercise. And it's a good idea to have someone in the team who is like an advocate for your learners, who speaks up for them, because they can get very sidelined in a tech project. And that person should be like a devil's advocate that tells the team things they don't want to hear. And actually, I found out recently, in engineering and investigative journalism, this is actually a role in big engineering projects and investigative journalism. Someone is there to tell you that where you're going wrong, and it's an acknowledged role. And actually, I would say that's gold dust in any project. And it's a free rein to be a pain. Yeah, so that would be the other thing is maintain your user profile. It will change over time.
That's a really important point, John, isn't it? About user involvement. It's not just something that you do at the beginning, tick the box and move on. It's something that needs to be done throughout the whole course of the project. And as you said, needs will change. Dan, do you want to try and come in again? See if we can get your sound to work.
Anyone?
It's not good. You're muted.
I think, can I just say, I think I picked up a bit of what Dan was saying there in, the odd words. I think what Dan was saying is that sometimes maybe we don't always do learner profiling. You might start out on a job and not actually sit down and actively do it. What I would say is that I think some really talented learning designers, they're thinking about the learner all the time, and they're just gathering the information in almost a subliminal way. So maybe it's just, you might just spend 5 minutes scribbling it down on the back of an envelope, and that's going to do it for you. It doesn't need to be, what I'm saying is it doesn't need to be a really big effort to do this, because talented designers are thinking about this stuff all the time. They're gathering information about their audience all the time, and they're doing it in that subliminal way. I noticed there was a question from Patrick. Done. So I don't know. You want me to just answer that? Because so Patrick, I think you asked, is there an example of a time where there was a disaster when you didn't know your learners? I'll give you a fairly, sounds like a really obvious example now, but I saw this happening an awful lot a few years ago. Online learning programs would be rolled out to people who did not have access to a computer. Now that might, at work, that might sound balmy, but for example, on oil rigs, when I was working on a project with BP, they had an online induction, which you had to do on a computer. It wasn't available to people before they got onto the oil rig because they hadn't been set up with a login. And when they got to the oil rig, it was one computer for every 20 people. So of course that just didn't work. And also examples of where that's happened in the motor industry with motor apprentices working in garages and workshops, expected to just sit down at a laptop on a bench to the side with no headphones and just complete some online learning. Just obviously completely inappropriate delivery platform there.
Yeah. I've got stories like that too. Millions of pounds.
We're going to take one more question on this before we move on, and I think this is a question for you, John. Omarian's asking, what's the right time frame to revisit user profiles?
Well, first of all, before you start your project, ideally, have some idea of your users. Write it down. Just a little written profile would be good, and follow the ideas that Rachel has been putting in there. Revisit. I think it should be a constant process, and it doesn't need to be a big deal. Especially, you can use the testing process as part of refreshing your user profile. Because information about your users and learners is actually gold dust. I know I keep using that word, but it's access to learners and end users is so important. That would be it. It's iterative.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much to the panel. So we've talked about accessing our learners. So let's just think about which type of organizations are in a good position to reach the learners furthest from learning. Because many of the learners the challenge wishes to target will have had a bad experience of formal education. So how well, and this is a question for you, John, how well are educational institutions such as FE colleges able to reach out and engage with people who are furthest from learning?
I think the answer is it's very mixed. And I think also we need to widen our ideas about what is an educational institution at this point in history. There's a lot of different organisations now involved in education and vocational education. So there's higher education. I'll talk about that in a little minute. FE, which I work in. I've worked in further education and higher education. But there's also really important other areas, local authorities, community education. We're talking about hard to reach learners. Commercial organisations that are involved in, say, apprenticeship training, specialist technical training. The so-called third sector is also important. Community groups, charities, people like the Prince's Trust, for instance, they're involved in hard to reach learners. So on a negative way, you could say that the education system in the UK is now very fragmented, or you could say it's very diverse, depending which way you want to look at it. But the reality of it is the education organisation landscape is very wide and very diverse. So I think that's a really important point to make. But if you like traditional educational organisations like FE colleges, I think we need, especially in England, although Scotland has not been immune to it, they're under extreme financial pressure and political pressure, constant reorganisations. In Scotland, for instance, in about the last 10 years, it's 25% cut in real terms, which has been done under the cover of mergers. So for FE colleges, there's been a lot of pressure to generate income. So let's see. If I was in an FE college in a position of authority, if you like, I would be recommending to people that the people in the college, and this would go for universities too, maintain a contact list of community and commercial organisations that they're in touch with. Often that information isn't centralised. It is in the heads and hearts of individuals scattered around the organisation. And it would be good from a, if you like, a business intelligence point of view to understand those links that an organisation has got with the community and businesses. It's very, very easy to lose that information, and whole opportunities can disappear. So that would be a tip for FE colleges in that sense. Higher education is generally, unfortunately, withdrawing from community education, which is a shame. And they will mostly cope with deal with self-motivated learners or learners who've been directed to them, but not always. Some higher education institutions do have good community links. So that would be something to prospect if you've got a local university for palling up with and doing things with. FE colleges traditionally have got good community links and links with local businesses. But they need to, if you like, cultivate that and store it and use it well. How do they reach out? Look at your existing activity. Often community learning in colleges is underfunded and overlooked. I would suggest that colleges use that to prospect for those difficult learners, but also links, professional links, individuals links to professional networks in the third sector are really important. We found in citizen literacy, most of our important information has actually come from those professional networks of people who are already involved in and motivated to reach hard-to-reach learners. Traditional organisations, it will not be at the top of their list.
Thanks, John. That's really, really interesting to hear about that from the FE perspective, if not a bit depressing. But then that's the reality of the world that we're in. Rach, I'm glad to have you back, Dan.
Thank you.
While you get
perhaps you can hear me. I'm hoping.
Oh well, we can. While you get settled in again, can I just ask Rachel whether you've got any kind of follow on from John's comments about who else, apart from maybe FE colleges, might be in a good position to reach the hard to reach learners?
Yes, well, John's given a really fantastically comprehensive answer, so there's not much I can add, but maybe I'll just take us back to football for a second, with quite an obvious example here. I mean, role models can make such an impact, and as we know, Marcus Rashford, I have to say, seems to have in recent weeks single-handedly got boys under 10 to start reading. Which is a phenomenal achievement, isn't it? And it just shows you about the power of those kind of role models. I mean, it's a cliche to say that sport is a really good starting point for boys in particular, but I mean, it's true. It is. So I suppose that's another way in. I mean, you've got to get the celebrities on board, obviously, and they've got to want to do it. But I don't think we can underestimate that power of personalities like that.
In terms of reaching hard to reach learners, I was thinking about employers. I don't know how to extent we talk about employers really, but lots of employers have staff who haven't had a formal educational experience that's been very successful, might be lacking functional skills. And I can think of some UFI projects probably who've got really positively minded employers who have really made a difference in putting together programs to reach those people that really needed lifting up.
Yeah. That's true, and obviously our whole focus is on vocational skills, and employers are an absolute key part of that. And if we can get employers on board and reach through employers, then obviously it can really increase people's motivation to do that. Which kind of brings me on to my next question, and I really hope we can hear you, Dan, because I'd really like to hear what you think about this, and that this challenge is all about improving learner confidence and motivation to learn vocational skills. Can you tell us about when you've been involved in a project which successfully motivated learners to learn?
So I'm going to go for it now, and if I suddenly become inaudible, give me some thumbs downs. But how's that? Can you hear me?
Yes, brilliant.
Brilliant. So the thing is, I lack lots of examples from the commercial e-learning sector. That's really revealing about the fact that it's not often prioritised. The vast bulk of my work is with universities and corporations, and basically the learner's motivation is presumed. It's taken as a given. Just fire some contact at them and go, which can generate all sorts of problems. And the example that came to mind was a really vibrant one about a learning project for children, a history game called Dig It Up for the BBC that I wrote with archaeologists trying to rescue artifacts before a car park can be built by an evil supermarket to hide Roman and Saxon remains. Now, usually I'm the writer and the learning designer, and I don't meet the learners face to face, and I wouldn't have seen it in action. But by coincidence, it was being used at my children's school, and I was there on an open day. And to cut a long story short, it was so much fun to play, the kids were literally fighting each other to game and thus to learn about history. So the game designers knew that to play, they made something really fun and creative, and it worked on that basis. And that was for kids, but the same is true for adults. And Readable, as most people on this call will know, is one of my favorite UFI projects. It's chat fiction for adults. So basically, it's fiction in short form on a phone that teaches people who aren't particularly strong in to become better so through storytelling. And that was all about motivation. One of the kind of learner personas they had was an exhausted mum who's from Turkey, comes at the end of a night shift, wants to help her kids with their schoolwork, needs to speak English better. And it had to be genuinely engaging so that people would want to learn from it. So the content was genuinely entertaining. EastEnders, writers from the In-Betweeners, really radical in an online learning context. Comedy that was funny, horror that was horrifying with severed heads and fridges. Most learning is PG rated at best, and adult learners really respond to content that's fit for adults in an emotional sense, I've found. And that's still a really and sadly radical approach. I think in general in online learning, we fail to think of learners as an audience. I'm sure Rachel's got some stuff to say about this. And we treat them as units to be shoved through a centrally designed curriculum. We do stuff to them rather than provide stuff for them. And I think there's a massive difference. They're often coerced to pass an exam or do something because their manager told them to. And so motivation is, if we're honest, seen as a nice to have. Now, of course, in reality, it isn't a nice to have for a successful learning experience. But in practice, metrics like participation, enrollment, completion rates, nominal completion rates, often aren't driven by genuine learner motivation at all. So it can be done, but it's very often neglected. That's hopefully some of that came through.
That's absolutely brilliant, Dan. That kind of like a cry from the heart. Rachel, John, do you want to comment on that? Maybe Rachel first.
Yep.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, actually, I think working at a broadcaster, I was quite lucky because the one thing you can say about the BBC is that they have got very high audience. So we were in a position where we were able to create make some quite creative solutions. So I'm actually going to flip this round and talk about motivating people in a different set of ways. So back to production. We were making something for researchers, television researchers, who have to do something called recce when you go out and check out a location. And quite often the wrong information was coming back. People were turning up to shoots and, you know, the sun was in the wrong place, or there was some roadworks going on, or whatever, and it was very expensive. This was an optional course that we created for the researchers. But what we realised that we needed to do was basically give them a tool. And that was how we were going to motivate them to then get them into the learning. So we provided them with a checklist, which was either a mobile device or printable. And as they worked through the checklist, there were little learning nuggets just embedded in each bit. So they could use the checklist as a tool. And while they were doing it, they could learn about all the stuff that they needed to think about when they were doing a recce. And we also motivated people by offering them a clipboard for the first 100 people who completed the course. So a bit of bribery there as well. And actually it got a really, really high take up for something that was digital amongst that audience.
That's brilliant. John, did you want to come in?
Yeah, coming back to citizen literacy, we know what was demotivating to people, and that's useful to know as well. We understood adult learners really were turned off by being given literacy materials for children because there's a shortage of digital materials for adult literacy learners. So we deliberately made our app, if you like, not boring, but not childish, which was a big deal for our learners. And the response so far has been really positive. So knowing what demotivates your learners is also really, really important. Yeah, that would be a big tip.
That's great. That's really, obviously really useful. And now I've come to my final question here, which is at UFI, we believe in the power of technology to improve access to vocational skills. How can tech help us know more about our learners? How can tech help us know more about our learners, preferably before we spend a lot of money building the solution? And
if my audio's still here, I might strike while the audio's hot. And,
please do.
Sorry to cut across. I've probably got the least to say as well. So I was going to say, think about this before the call. Before the solution, you've got simple survey tools. You know, you could survey people with SurveyMonkey. That's really affordable, cheap and cheerful. You could just ask the learners. You could also host some virtual focus groups when you seek feedback on specification examples before you go any further. I'm currently taking that approach with a project I'm working on for the United Nations related to the SDGs, the development goals, where we consulted a representative group of potential learners about what they'd find useful in the solution based on our initial thinking, just using Teams or tools like this. But I'd say if you're an FE, and maybe John would have an opinion on this, if you've got a cohort of learners already in this, then you can look at their online portfolios, for example, using tools like Padlet. What have they made already? What do they like doing? You know, when they talk to each other, what do they say? What are their actual interests? A bit of audience research. And then I'd say within the UFI context that if you're doing a pilot of a minimum viable product or an early slimmed down version, try and use that tracking and observation tech to see what the learners respond to. And I know Rachel knows a heck of a lot about this, I think. You know, what they clicked on, what they didn't, what they looked at, what they lingered on, which they skipped. You know, they may say they want certain things when you talk to them directly, but what does their behaviour show when they're actually using it? I think that's a real goldmine of information. But I'm conscious that Rachel and John know I do about the things I've sketched out, so I'm gonna step back now.
No, I think that's a really good point. You use the information that's already in front of you and that you've got access to. In an FE setting and in HE, you potentially got a lot of analytic data of who's logging in, how long they're logging in, stuff. And even the OU, who's been leading in that area, has admitted that they don't use it well enough, that the academics in the OU tend to ignore the messages that come out of analytics, which is a bit contradictory. Also, the presence of internal myths in organisation is important, especially in the ed tech scene. There is a mental model of learners that tends to persist, and we've touched upon this already, that the learner is well connected digitally. They've got access to broadband, they've got certain skills. Because they're young, for instance, they'll be a whiz with the technology. And these are myths, because you might be a whiz with PlayStation, but when you get on an institutional VLE, you are in tech 101 hell, basically. A lot of these things just don't work very well. And we've had countless examples of students saying, what the heck is this? You know, I can't use this. So the other thing is the pandemic has shown a hell of a lot of people only have an internet device, which is their smartphone. And a lot of organizations, especially in mainstream education, I would say will live in deliberate denial of that underlying fact of digital poverty. So designing for mobile first, for hard to reach learners, is probably a good idea. You can't presume they're on good quality broadband and on a laptop. So it comes back to learn as much about your learners as you can, and without sounding too fancy, it's more if you like, an ethnographic challenge. You know, you need to understand the lives of your learners in every aspect to do the best job you can.
Yeah. Rachel, you're nodding away. Final word from you on this one?
Yes, well, I was going to say, I mean, obviously there are so many tools around now that track our every movement, what we're eating, what we're drinking, how we're exercising, where we're going. I think it sometimes feels like Google knows what we're thinking. So there is a huge amount of data available now. Dan made a reference to, you know, online profiles, for example. There are obviously some ethical questions that come up in relation to that. I mean, we know now that a lot of employers will go and look up the social media profiles of potential employees, but that does raise, I think, quite a lot of ethical questions, and particularly in the workplace. What I would say is that before I start any qualitative research project, whether it's learning based or otherwise, I will always look for some quantitative data. So that could well be analytics, as we both mentioned, of a web-based service or an app. And the tools available now are really good. But as I think John just referred to, sometimes people don't know how to use them. I mean, Google Analytics, it sometimes can give you really quite false results, actually. And I've seen quite a few examples of where it's been misunderstood. That's not really the user's fault. It's because Google has made a bunch of assumptions that you're going to understand what it's delivering you. So, but also, you know, you might want to look at records from an IT help desk or health and safety records or things like that to get an understanding of, you know, where are the organizational problems here? Where are the things where people are getting things wrong? So all of that is really, really useful. And because now, you know, we can process this data much faster and in a variety of ways, we can really investigate people digitally. But of course, as John has just said, you've got to combine that with understanding the real person. And I still believe the only way that you can do that is to meet them. But now we can meet them virtually. We don't have to like go to the expense of necessarily meeting them face to face. So we can then use digital to actually get to know people across a much wider geographical area and potentially all around the world if we want to through a video-based online meeting.
Thanks, Rachel. That's great. That's probably all we've got time for. I just want to call everyone's attention to Patrick's comments in the chat, where he says, forgive me if I'm quoting you, Patrick, he said, sorry to state the obvious, but it sounds like deeply understanding learner motivation is the critical element to the learner profiling for this funding call. And I would say that's absolutely right.
Mm.
And with that, I'm going to say that's it. I'd like to thank you very much for joining us today, and a particular thank you to our panel. So thank you, Rachel. It's been great to have you.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Brilliant to have you here.
Thanks.
And thanks to Dan.
Thank you.
Great to have you. So for all of you still listening, updates on the fund will be sent to you by the UFI community newsletter, which you signed up for when you registered for this workshop. You can also follow us on social media. Later on, we'll send you an email, which will include a link to the video of this discussion we've had today. If you've enjoyed this one, and I hope you have, there are 2 further Explore workshops running, one on testing on the 13th of July and another on learning design on the 21st. The links to both of those are on our main VocTech challenge page on the website to sign up. Really hope you find the workshop useful. If you could take a few minutes to provide us with some feedback, that would be appreciated. And a link to the survey will be dropped in the chat. So thank you very much, everyone, for taking part. And we look forward to seeing you at the next Explore workshop. Okay, great to have seen everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.